So New Zealand is coming up to the centenary of the faith being here in Aotearoa, but we have had Baha'i activity out in the Pacific Islands. Could you mention some of the early Baha'i believers that were first in the Pacific Islands?
For the benefit of viewers for the program, to know that the Baha'i teachings commenced with the revelation of Bahá'u'lláh in the 19th century. But at the time that Baha'u'lláh had passed away in 1892, the Baha'i teachings had already been well known through the various newspapers in New Zealand. And there were in fact New Zealanders who had heard of the Baha'i teachings, maybe from travelling overseas, meeting people in different countries. And so that by the early 1900s, and certainly into the 1920s, there were a number of members in New Zealand. The growth in the Pacific Islands is scattered through the 1940s and then particularly in the 1950s. There's a lot of interesting detail in there. For example, during the Second World War, there were a number of young Baha'is who were in the various forces, military forces that were in the Pacific, but they were there in non-combatant roles with ambulance corps, etc., taking the Baha'i teachings to New Guinea and to other islands, maybe to Vanuatu as well. That's in the 1940s. But it's in the 1950s that a number of individuals particularly from Australia and New Zealand, but also as far away as Iran, came to the Pacific, and the Micronesian states of the North Pacific were entered by American Baha'is. And this was all in the period roughly from 1953-54 through the next decade or so. And so you saw a rapid expansion of Baha'i communities at that time in the Pacific.
Was there something significant about this expansion at that particular time?
Well, from my reading, and also from speaking to as many Pacific Islanders as possible on my travels in the Pacific, and also to some of these first, we call pioneers, people who, they're not missionaries in the sense of being paid to go, but they're people who redeployed, got jobs in the Pacific as nurses or teachers or as having their own trade stores, that sort of thing. And you're asking me what was unique about being in the Pacific in the 1950s and 60s and taking the Baha'i message. And the one powerful factor that comes through is the Baha'i teaching of the oneness of humankind. The Baha'is believe that all religions come from the same divine source. So the Baha'is have great respect for Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and other great faiths. In the Pacific, Christianity has had a great influence for 200 to 300 years and has brought great benefits to the Pacific: literacy, education, health, and many other teachings that are fundamental to Christian civilization. But when the Baha'is came in the 1950s, they brought this concept of race equality into the way that they interacted with Pacific Islanders. And there are very specific episodes. Think of Honiara, where an early Solomon Islander from the Western Solomons, his name was Bill Gina. And he heard that there were some Europeans living up on a hill who would have him into their house. And he had never heard before of Europeans who would welcome people into their house, because at that time there was such a segregation. Even though it's the Solomons' country, they're the people of the Solomon Islands, and yet people who were working in the British regime there, the colonial administration, didn't have them in the house. So he went up to the house of Alvin and Gertrude Blum, and he knocked on the door to test whether it was true that they would welcome him in. And they welcomed him in. And so through that process of saying, what is it about these people that they will have us into their homes, that he gradually heard that they were Baha'is, and the message spread through his community at that time. That was part of Western Solomons. There are other stories from later as well, the same type of story. And I have the same type of story from Papua New Guinea, where your relative, Rodney Hancock, when he went in New Britain and to other parts of Papua New Guinea, but the simple act of eating at the same table as Papua New Guineans back in the 50s was enough for them to say, this man is sincere. And those people who came in touch with Rodney Hancock and Vi Hunker and others were attracted by this very simple process of sharing a meal. And this is a very simple but profound start to a lot of the Baha'i communities in the Pacific.